Good morning. My name is Joy, and I am so excited to be joining you guys today. I know that this conference has gone through a lot of different changes, as we all have over the last year, to where it started out in person and then it ended up getting postponed. And now we have the opportunity to join you through the virtual conference that A4LE has put together. So I'm very excited to be able to talk to you about WELL fundamentals and starting to look at how the WELL Building Standard and their certification program naturally aligns with successful learning environments and some of the concepts that you guys have been exploring as far as how do we start to put together successful schools and learning environments for our kids, and what are the natural overlaps there with the WELL Building Standard. So a little bit about me. I have been in the business of connecting people with their architectural places for close to 19 years now. Across a variety of different building types, dozens of clients and conversations just like the one that we're about to have with numerous people over the years. Wonderful project experiences have included everything from the Las Vegas Convention Center to Terminal 3 at McCarran International Airport, and then a wide range of both public and private educational facilities, ranging from elementary schools all the way up through higher education facilities. I would say that I've spent my career pretty much focused on connecting those individuals with communities. And I think what I love the most is that every project is a different puzzle. Sometimes you get really well-defined pieces, but other times you're also shaping those pieces as well as the final image of what we can create through that process. So I would say much of the fun is really guiding people as they start to wake up and notice those spaces. Especially when they start to feel empowered to take an active role. So we will talk a lot about that today, as far as like how do we take some of the concepts that we'll be talking about and empower people to be able to take action and steps to be able to improve those learning environments. With SCS, I would say we have really focused on really the heart of our practice has been learning environments. Both schools and libraries, public workspaces, and then also workplaces. And we've had the great privilege of being able to work on so many different educational facilities across the years with great clients that have been really collaborative in that process and have allowed us great opportunities to be able to create these wonderful communities for our local communities and also regional community over time. So in 19, or not 19, that'd be quite a while ago, but like in 2017, I was selected to join the WELL faculty team, which has actually been one of the highlights of my career based on my personal connection that I have with their vision and the future of their buildings. So I'm going to take just a moment to talk about what we're going to talk about today to give you some context of where we are and where we're headed. And an overview. We're going to start out with some overall concepts, trends and statistics, both around buildings, health, and schools. And then we're going to go over the WELL certification system itself, kind of the nuts and bolts of how the system is put together. And then we'll do a deeper dive into a few of the specific WELL features. And then we'll wrap up by reviewing opportunities for those learning environments based on these principles that we'll talk about. So before we jump into some of the statistics, what I'd like to talk about is just a little bit of concept, like how we perceive the places that we spend so much time in. And so I would say that places have personalities, just like people. And just like the relationships that you have with people, some of these are positive and supportive, inspiring, and some may be really negative or even dysfunctional. There's a wide range, and then kind of based on those relationships, also a wide range of opportunities for us to be able to enhance those relationships. I like to say that buildings are often treated a lot like a backdrop to our life instead of what they really are, which are active collaborators. There's really an underlying connection between you and those building spaces that directly impacts your health and well-being, whether or not you're aware of it or not. So by bringing those buildings out of the background, acknowledging their influence, and focusing on a process that we can find to partner with them, your mind, your body, and your schools will flourish would be the goal. I really enjoy Jim Rohn, and so one of my favorite quotes of his is that you are the average of the 5 people that you spend the most time with. And so I would challenge us all to kind of flip that for our conversation today, to say that we are really the average of the 5 places that we spend the most time in. Statistics are showing that we're spending 87% of our time indoors, even more if you start to count the time that you're in an automobile or other type enclosed spaces. And of that, 50% of our awake hours are spent sitting, so basically sedentary. With the average lifespan around 80 years old, this translates to almost 70 years, 69.6 years of our life that will be spent inside of a building from a statistical perspective. And if we take that to our students and we start to look at how much time are they really spending in schools, by the time that a student graduates from high school, they will have spent 15,600 hours inside of a school. That number is only secondary to the amount of time that they spend in homes. So our learning environments are one of the most important spaces that our students are spending time in. When you start to look at it, there's been a lot of research on this topic, and according to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, social and physical environments are the largest determinants of health. And this is even more than genetics and lifestyle choices. And within that, wellness in general is the next trillion-dollar industry. And within this forecast, design for healthy behaviors is the single largest subtrend. So there are links between our building designs, our behaviors, and our health outcomes that directly affect the places we live, work, play, and certainly where we learn. So in architecture, the overarching result of what we're seeing with these trends is a growing emphasis on people-focused design. So these are a couple studies done by the Harvard Health and Buildings program, which I know many of you guys are familiar with the Schools for Health publications. This one was just recently updated in January of 2021 and is called kind of the Foundations for Student Success. You know, the premise is really that school buildings are the foundation for student success. And on the flip side of that, they can also adversely affect both short and long-term learning outcomes. So they went through the process of, you know, going through 200 studies, over 70 different health performance indicators, to be able to develop these 9 foundations, the 9 foundations of a healthy building. So you can see here, air quality, thermal health, moisture, dust and pest, safety and security, water quality, noise, lighting and views, and ventilation. So they put together kind of this approach to, if you focus on these things, these would be the foundational elements to be able to get to a healthy building. And then within each of these different subsets, like for example, if you were to take just noise, you know, you start to look at both the internal and the externally generated noise in buildings, and then the direct correlation between that in a building and the learning outcomes of our students, you know, and how that starts to lead to different health implications as far as stress and fatigue, even emotional and behavioral outcomes. And then that starts to translate to what are the true learning outcomes? You know, are they able to speak and listen for comprehension? What is happening to their memory and their testing? And how is that all adversely or positively enhanced by what we do at building foundational level? This group also, over the last year, spent some time, and many of you may also be familiar with this, but developing the risk reduction and strategies for reopening schools. And you will see here, it's kind of a blend of operations and policy and also building systems, which in many ways overlaps how well is structured, which we'll talk a little bit more so about as we move forward. But there are amazing overlaps between the Harvard Healthy Building programs and what they've been exploring and what WELL focuses on. We say in general that WELL is a friendly system that has many partnerships, collaborations, crosswalks to other certification systems. The director for the Healthy Buildings program, Joseph Allen, is also kind of part of the WELL community. And so as you take what you're already familiar with in the studies that have been being done at an educational level and start to kind of overlap those with some of the features that we're starting to see in the designs and operation and policy recommendations in WELL, I think you'll see that there are some really positive overlaps. So kind of hopping to how we even got involved with WELL, we had the opportunity to hear about the program for the first time in 2016. And so it was still version 1 at that time. WELL has now graduated to version 2, but we ended up following up what we had heard. It really resonated with what we kind of believed to be good quality design on many levels. And so in 2017, our office was the first office to be registered for WELL in the state of Nevada. And so we were really early adopters of the philosophy and the program. We like to say that kind of our process entails discovery and creation, and then you experience that. And then really oftentimes you need to kind of come back and adjust that based on it. So as we were going through this process, we decided that we would be the guinea pigs. And so we ended up collecting a lot of data, and you'll see the importance of data as we move forward into diving into the system. But we collected a lot of performance data and then also survey data so that we could start to blend those to know, like, what did we have from a functional perspective? What do we have from a perception perspective? And then how do we align that into good strategies moving forward? And there are opportunities within that in our school environments in general. I would say that kind of in any given moment, you're kind of you're walking in with the memories that you have, and they go with you as you go through life, and your design identity kind of evolves along with those experiences. And so for us, it was also kind of important to test out some of these principles ourselves before then kind of translating them into the architecture that we were creating out in the community. So let's start to dive into WELL and kind of a history of WELL fundamentals. Version 2, so like as I was mentioning, it started out in version 1, and then in 2018, the pilot for version 2 was released, and over the course of the next 2 years, especially given the findings and kind of the situation that we all kind of lived through over the course of this last year, there was significant input at a community level and just with experts across various fields in the development of version 2. So basically all the best parts of version 1 were taken, and then it was robustly looked at from many different angles to be able to take all of that data and incorporate it into version 2. One of the big, or really kind of the four tenets of WELL, if you start to look at it, is that it's evidence-based, which is really critical. So you'll see as we go through all of these different features that all of it is based on evidence and best practices. Like, so what is the data showing us, and then what is best practice in the industry? And then let's take that and let's start to look at that and figure out, like, what is that, where does that really guide us in the development of design principles? And then from there, can it be verified? So performance is a huge, performance verification is a huge tenet of WELL, to be able to say, like, here's the documentation and the design intent, but then what is the building really doing? What kind of feedback is the building giving us, and making sure that we're monitoring and tracking that, so that our building is really doing what we hope that it will do coming out of the design process. Then from there, is it able to be implemented? And WELL is global. The intent is that these principles would be able to be applied in many different areas and different global pieces of the world, well, basically in many different areas of the world, and that it would be able to be implemented across many different types of projects. And then from there, kind of the final piece is just like I was mentioning, outside input. So just making sure that it's presented and vetted at kind of a robust scientific level across many different disciplines. So let's talk a little bit about WELL certification and the process. Like I had mentioned, there was a big shift between version 1 and version 2 as far as how the points are structured and the ability to kind of customize the system to best fit with your priorities. So for those of you guys that are familiar with LEED, you'll see that there's kind of a point system, and depending on how many points you decide to pursue and then ultimately end up getting, that will determine the level that you get. There's 110 points possible, and then there are certain criteria within that you can't get. There'll be a maximum amount of points that will be able to be obtained within each of those categories. One of the big or two interesting variants on WELL from some other certification systems. One of the first one is that you still have the documentation process where, you know, there's design and verification, but then the second piece of that puzzle, like we were talking about, is performance verification. So there's a inspector that comes out to every WELL project and they verify some of the features are really meeting those the design criteria that we had hoped for. Then the third piece, you would obtain certification, but then there's also an ongoing commitment to being able to maintain a WELL building. So within WELL, like we were talking about, there are design, there's maintenance and kind of operations, and then there's policy. And so within that, the maintenance has to continue. Some of the policies need to continue. There are certain fundamental tenets of WELL that require that to kind of be an ongoing process to be able to be a WELL certified building. And within that as well, you'll also see that there are preconditions and optimizations. So every WELL building meets the preconditions. Those are mandatory, and every part of the precondition has to be met to really be considered a WELL building. And then those optimizations are the flexibility that has been added even more so with version 2. And so it can kind of be, you'll be able to kind of pick and choose which ones of those optimizations make the most sense for you guys and your organizations. If we come into, now let's talk categories. So in V1, there were actually only 7. And what has happened over the development of V2 is that there was an opportunity to be able to go back and look at those and like, where can we really start to see the greatest impact for health and that kind of focus on people-focused design? Where can we make the greatest impact? And so I think you'll see some of the overlaps, like we were talking about back to the healthy buildings studies early on. But I like to think of them as kind of the infrastructure criteria, where you're going to look at air, you're going to look at water, light, and also materials that are fundamentals that go within the building. And then you start to get into some of the more individual people-focused, kind of individual perspective with our nourishment and our movement, and then even to a certain extent thermal comfort and sound and the perception associated with those, kind of the combination. And then we'll also loop in mind and community, and what does that really start to look like. As you can see here, there's different quantities of features within each of those categories based on their impact and kind of the research that has gone along with that. So like in air, there may be 14 features, whereas sound may only have 5. And then underneath those, the preconditions and optimization quantities also vary. But like we were saying, all of the preconditions become mandatory in order to be a WELL certified building. First, you have flexibility within the optimizations. Okay, and this is starting to take a look at like what really builds up to an individual feature. So if we were to just take one of the features under movement, you know, it's going to have a number associated with it. It's called physical activity opportunities. You can see the O there afterwards indicating that it's an optimization rather than a precondition. And one of the amazing things that ended up getting layered in on V2 is that there's now kind of headings at the start of each of these features, to where there's a summary, there's an intent for the feature, there's an issue kind of outlining why it's so critical that we focus on that, and then there are also proposed solutions. And then within each of those features, there will be subset of parts, and the parts will have specific design strategies that could be proposed for that topic. And then all evidence is, since it is evidential based, all of the research is included for each of those features, so that if you're so inclined, you can go do, you can look deeper into each of those topics, or you can just even kind of look at the citations that go along with each of these features. So this is kind of looking at the graphic of it, and this is taking that same feature and showing you guys what it looks like in the actual WELL guide itself. So you can see that kind of top section with your intent summary, issue and solutions, and then the breakdown of the parts and design solutions under this. This one is actually quite interesting because it has a very interesting topic embedded in it, where, you know, I think if you probably can't read the text, but under part 1C, it says, as applicable, physical activity opportunities are not to be withheld as a form of punishment for early childhood education. And again, each of these are taking it at different levels. So one of the other big shifts that I hadn't mentioned yet is that previously with version 1, each typology would, like, they would have their own guide. So schools used to be kind of a separate guide than the version 1 overall WELL certification. And within this one, what's happened, V2 has incorporated all of those different building typologies into one certification system. So you'll have notes for if it's for education or early education even, versus like workplace environments, or even to a certain extent multifamily. So there's a range within now the WELL certification guide. So we're going to now shift into kind of more of a deep dive of concepts that we're seeing in these individual features. These 4 I have grouped because I know that there has been a lot of talk around these associated with the pandemic and just over the course of the last year, and then also to a certain extent within educational conversation and thought leadership around these topics in general. So we're not going to spend as long today on these. We're going to do a deeper dive into the other categories more so. But I did want to just kind of highlight them here from a general perspective. Like, so for example, with air, I know that there has been, and also in kind of the risk reduction strategies, a lot of conversation about like exchange rates for ventilation and then filtration, and how do we monitor that and know what's really going on in the building, and how do we control that and support kind of air quality in spaces. Or like, for example, in light, not only daylighting design strategies, but really starting to look at like, how do we have circadian lighting design implemented into our design strategies and concepts? How do we control for glare? How do we like make sure that there's the right foot candles at the surfaces that we need, but not only horizontally, but also vertically? And so, you know, there's a lot of great content here, but as there's been a lot of conversation about it, we're not going to do as deep a dive on this today, but this is all kind of also embedded within those 10 categories. Where we are going to look a little bit more deeply is like, for example, here, like with mind to start. So there's been a lot of talk about mental health. And mental health is really determined by like a range of socioeconomic, biological, and environmental factors. And mental health and even substance use conditions are a widespread health concern. And so we're even seeing this in younger populations, right? But depression and anxiety are one of the leading cause of just kind of the global burden of disease in general. And so, and then there hasn't up to date been much investment into mental health on a per person basis. And so starting to recognize that there are complex relationships that exist between our minds and our bodies. And this interplay can significantly impact health and well-being. And so the built environment's an opportunity, right? Like it serves as a powerful tool to be able to mitigate these adverse health outcomes. And so how do we start to look at that from a policies and program and design perspective? And so if we kind of, and again, within these, there's going to be, you know, these might be overarching concepts. So, you know, different strategies that might be used, but then when you go into individual features, like for example, here, MO2 would be like nature in place. And under that, there would start to be, you know, like the 14 patterns of biophilic design, and kind of starting to look at like, what is the link between nature and human biology and buildings, and starting to look at the various categories, whether it be nature and space, or some of those other tenets, and starting to carry them forward. And so there starts to become design opportunities. And many of those that we have talked about before might be the more natural, or might be the more straightforward, such as introducing plants or water or natural views into buildings. But it also starts to go into that a little bit more deeply, and like, how do you start to design and craft the spaces to be able to imply nature in addition to just some of the more direct solutions. And then also actually within nature in place, it starts to do kind of a deeper dive into like the meaning, right? Like, so how do you start to go into some of these ideas and bring forward like the idea of celebration of culture and place and the integration of art and human delight? And how do we start to support the mind and those needs through these other design strategies? Another way, in addition, just kind of health, education, and promotion, but from a design perspective, if we start to look like what is really restorative, like how do we start to design restorative spaces even into our schools? So within the movement or within the classroom or within the common spaces that we have within our educational environments, how do we really start to make them places where the mind can relax and the mind can calm down and begin to think and listen in a different way at a different pace. And that can be everything from like a difference in thermal comfort. How do we control the sounds? How do we maybe start to bring in more natural sounds, more natural lighting, different types of seating, different coloring, visual privacy, going back to those tenets of biophilic design. How do we start to very intentionally and very strategically bring them in with the purpose of mental well-being for our students? Another big one that there's been a lot of talk about recently is movement, and especially even more so coming out of this year, right? But physical inactivity has been a huge focus within public health community for many, many decades, just because there's such a direct link toward physical activity and a whole series of different diseases and negative health conditions. So even, and in some ways too, like the numbers have progressively been getting worse. And I think that was even before some of the pre-COVID numbers I've seen. So I can only imagine that they are even less at this point. But like if we start to look at like adolescents and older populations, like we're looking at physical activity to where it's like 80% or even 50% of them respectively are not really engaging in physical activity. But there's kind of two pieces of that puzzle. So there's physical activity, but then there's just that sedentary behavior that we were talking about, right? So our sedentary lifestyles are absolutely rising. So and it's distinct from physical inactivity because it's basically characterized by just very low intensity, low effort activities such as sitting. We're not really moving our bodies, let alone then physically engaging them in a more robust way. So it's a combination of both of those that this category of movement is really starting to address. And then if we start to look at some very specific design strategies, and again, policies or behaviors that we could start to dive into a little bit more deeply under this, ergonomics in general, and just starting to be aware of how do we provide either chairs, stations, computers, elements for that individual body, going back to that, like how do we make the individual body be able to be proactive in that space and to be able to adjust based on what we're doing. And to a certain extent, like also, how do we give our students the ability to stand up, to adjust, to micro adjust? Is really critical. There's been a lot of talk in workplace environment about sit-stand desks or being able to have standing areas where people can land. So what opportunities do we see to be able to kind of integrate that within our learning environments? Are there areas in the classroom that we can start to zone in different ways that we allow students the choice to be able to listen to their body while still having it be a controlled environment from a teaching perspective. So there's opportunity there to review that. One of the other items that's talked about quite a bit is how can we be intentional in our placement and how we treat some of our circulation elements. So for example, if we have a stair, how do we make that visually pleasing and obvious as people walk into the building? Please take the stair and not necessarily the elevator. There's opportunities to be able to make that the easiest choice. And then within that, how do we make the stairs, how do we have fun with them? Really, like, can we make sure that they have positive light? Are there skylights? Can we put art? Is there different music? Or like my favorite, gamification, like how do we make it fun to be on the stairs? And especially with our younger population, right? Like the students are so willing to be able to do that if we make that easy and accessible to them on many different levels. So how do we start to kind of take what are natural elements within the building and use them as an opportunity instead of a functional element? One kind of also final opportunity with this. So with site planning and selection, that becomes critical as far as like pedestrian streets. But if you start to look at it, it's also, many of our schools are set up in a campus type setting. So how do we take the opportunities of what would really be like a pedestrian, more like a pedestrian friendly environment, even if it's interior to our school campuses, and start to look at like overhangs and shading, or like here, there are so many different opportunities for murals or an expression that really makes that kind of exterior environment as students are walking around, or our campuses that are set up kind of in that way, like career technical academies are different type. school environments where they're moving, how do we set them up almost for a pedestrian friendly experience so that they're out and they're walking. Let's see. I think that's it on this one. There was one more thought, but like we've got other features to go through. But one thing that I was going to say about this is just in general, one of the topics that has had a lot of traction lately is this idea that for early education type programs, how do we start to look at a program that basically reduces the daily time spent in sedentary behaviors? And so it's like, how do we also take what we're already doing in the classroom and maybe set up either through education, conversation, habits, really a way for kids to kind of detach in the same way that adults need to from like computers or smartphones or TV or, you know, all of those things, especially coming out of this year, and set up like physical activities that could be integrated into the classrooms, into the curriculum. You know, we've had this wonderful ability to be able to layer technology in, but like, how do we now coming out into this, into the future, be able to balance those two things, the technology and then also the ability to move our bodies and do different things physically in our classroom environments. All right, so nourishment. So proper nutrition basically remains kind of one of the top things for disease globally. Pretty much 1 in 5 deaths globally are based on this. In fact, unhealthy diets are basically a greater risk than a lot of substance abuse. And so how do we start to look at not only like the prevalence in overweight and obesity and diseases, but then also the quality of the food that we're eating has less nutrients in it. So it's like what we're eating is also less healthy for us, and then the amount and quantities, and how do we educate our kids and layer that into our schools in a positive way. Well, it's set up that if any food is offered, these features become mandatory. And so like there's some basic within the preconditions elements that have to be met in what we're offering. So for example, with this one, fruits and veggies, some of this is basic concepts of how do we start to layer in healthy nutrition. And again, kind of going back to the STAR conversation, how do we make it really easy? So under fruits and vegetables, how do we start to just promote them and make them the easy selection for students? And so are they up in front? How do we make it so that that's the first thing that they see or they grab or they want? Food advertising, how do we basically make sure that we're only advertising healthy foods? And then, you know, also within that, like one of my favorites is healthy portions. So when I had first got familiar with Well, I went out and I bought like all the plate sizes and cup sizes and things that were recommended. And it's pretty amazing how much smaller they are than what you think. And Well does a really great job of like going in and starting to subdivide it from in version 2 of like adult to secondary to more elementary age kids, and starting to look at like what is really a healthy portion size. And then once we identify that, how do we make sure that the kids understand what they're eating? They're prompted to eat and make good selections for themselves, and we kind of and they understand from a health education perspective the value in that. So that takes us to thermal comfort and sound. Now, what I love about both of these categories is that both of them have a significant amount of data available that we can reference as far as like guidelines and what that looks like as far as design recommendations. But then there is this second added layer of perception. And in both cases, human perception of noise or human perception of the thermal environment is equally important, if not more so than some of the data. There's a really subjective quality to both of these. So like we know with thermal comfort that there's like a human productivity that is connected to how comfortable people are within those spaces. I think one of the definitions is that it's like how the individual expresses satisfaction with the thermal environment, which is basically subjective in nature, right? Like it's a subjective evaluation. And in general, this is one of the things that is the most complained about in workplaces and schools, like as far as that control element that we were talking about earlier. Control plays a massive factor in people's perception of their thermal comfort. And so based on kind of all the different statistics that we see associated with this, a one-size-fits-all approach to thermal comfort in buildings basically fails for the majority of people. So as we start to look at it, how do we kind of break it down into smaller steps to be able to control those different factors? When we look at kind of the individual ones, I think one of the first steps in both of these is to start by putting together a plan. Like what does an acceptable thermal environment look like? Or even in the case of sound, like what's your sound plan? Where are your noisy areas? Where are your quiet areas for thermal? Like where are your common areas, your conference rooms or your classrooms or your larger spaces versus like an office pod or the cafeteria, right? And so how do we start to identify what we think the needs are of those individual spaces? Then how do we come back in? And the missing component oftentimes is how do we survey and monitor for that? So are we talking to people? Are we getting feedback on how the classrooms are performing, how the individual spaces are performing? Are we giving people an opportunity to be able to talk about their needs and talk about their experience? And then how much can we individualize it? In some cases, I know that doesn't necessarily make sense, but how do we kind of get the zones down to more of that individual level? And how do we allow people within their spaces to have some control is a huge factor in that perception element of like how they perceive the space, right? So can we provide thermostats that they're able to control? Or if that's not the case, how do we come back in and provide personal cooling or heating options? In certain scenarios, there's even been so much to have in larger spaces, temperature differential so that people can kind of gravitate toward a hotter or a colder environment based on their own preferences, really, when it comes down to it. And then again, how do you verify it? And so how do you keep that kind of open communication, which is so critical for the success within these buildings? And then sound, like we had talked about, there are many different levels to this that are also subjective, starting out with like sound mapping. How do we start to get a baseline for that? How do we then take the data associated with it for noise levels or sound barrier solutions? And start to take that data that we have to be able to create more quality spaces. So you can see here maximum noise levels. Well, that's a basic. How do we start to take those basic solutions and make sure that they're incorporated into the specific space needs? Then how do we start to look at the shapes and the reverberation time in our classrooms? And so even kind of going back to the design for the healthy buildings earlier on and some of that statistical analysis, like the reverberation time, especially for younger elementary age students, is really critical for success. And then once we understand all those factors, how do we strategically start to layer in different surfaces or different design strategies or materials to combat this as well? One other important piece within this is just making sure that like at a baseline, you just have a solid HVAC system and making sure that our systems and our infrastructure support what we're doing. So starting from that kind of building level and then working our way in. So everything from like, how do we mitigate HVAC noise and internally generated noise in general, then how do we build the walls appropriately for the separations that we need, and then kind of working our way out into, surfaces, whether they be sound absorption or shape. All right, let's talk about community. Community is a huge category. And as you can see, it encompasses a wide range of like, how do we start to look at health from these really broad social and very important kind of community topics. So everything from like baseline, universal design, accessibility, how do we start to prepare for emergencies, support our families, and be involved civically, have diversity and inclusion. So like one of the things that I love about this category in general is that there are so many ways that you're able to customize this for what is important to you. That you can come back in and take any one of these parts and start to say like, you know what, this is really important to us as an organization, as a school, as a community, and we want to make sure that this is incorporated. But it also gives a really wide range of just like good practice for being a community partner from a building perspective. And then you can also see this as well, like the occupant surveys are really critical. So having like early stakeholder meetings, it just can't be overvalued. Like during the planning process, to be able to gather feedback and to be able to define like what are these like priorities, and then being able to promote that kind of community well-being through incorporating those within the solutions becomes pretty critical to success. All right, so this is just kind of not necessarily but just like one thing that we've been talking a lot about from a philosophy standpoint of how we really start to look at these and group them within different categories. So we like to say that it really takes 5 to thrive. And so if you really break it down to your body and our kids' bodies and everybody from that individual perspective, and then how do you start there and build out, right? So if we take just like the most intimate, you know, that kind of like internal body, like so internal body relationships really have to do with the structure of your body, everything from like elements of habits, ergonomics, posture, stretching, they all tie into that. And so simply by creating an attitude of mindfulness with people's body and then allowing them the choice to be able to start making those little adjustments we were talking about have huge positive health impacts. So it's really important, especially because our body sort of has muscle memory. And so it's one reason that habits become so important. And so if you start to take the well features and pull those in, how do we take those and really start to look at those as like the body starting as your launch point within the space? How do we again take it back to people-focused design at the most intimate level of the individual first, and then build out? Then if we start to come from that into more of like the body to body relationships, I like to call them the space bubbles, right? So you have your intimate space, closest to you, personal space, social space, and then also kind of going out to public space. I'd say that all of our space bubbles have changed over the course of this last year, but even before, you know, many factors would influence the comfortability of those dimensions within there, you know, the density, the familiarity, expectations, everything from culture and age and gender and preference and, you know, the roles. And so being mindful that our kids also have those dynamics and what they need to be able to be successful, and how do we honor those relationships between them and their peers, and then them and their teachers, and how do we start to layer those in to our design solutions, also set us up for success. Then if we kind of go from there into our body to building relationships, I like to say that, you know, good design scales for people, and there's a purpose, right? And it can trigger different emotional responses. So it's really about the relativity of our body to the building proportions and that human perspective. And so, you know, for example, if it was a cathedral, that's going to be designed for a very different scale, a very different intent, a very different feeling than, say, for example, a manufacturing plant or a cafeteria or a classroom or an intimate collaborative group. And so how do we start to take our school spaces that we have and recognize the need that there may be like different relationships? How do we create those like smaller environments for more of that like peer interaction versus how do we give the opportunity for those kind of larger scale environments? And how do we do it very intentionally from the perspective of that people perspective for success, you know, through noise solutions, comfort solutions, you know, lighting solutions, all of these different features start to play into each of these 5. Then we have our body to nature, like we talked about, the 14 patterns of biophilic design, and our body's relationship. We're kind of hardwired for nature. So the concepts of biophilic design focus on connecting the indoor human experience to natural elements. And so how do we just be mindful of that and do it very strategically, that it's not just like the plant, you know, but it's the plant and maybe the textures and the feeling and the airflow and all of these different elements that we seek. And then body to community, how do you take it kind of broader and really embed through purpose, through focus, through meaning, through vision, this connection at a not only a maybe smaller school level, but then also in our civic responsibility in our communities, and then even our global perspective as well. So the 5 to thrive. Okay, then I just want to kind of leave you guys today with this concept. You know, the whole idea that look, ask, and adjust. So sometimes I think it can become a little bit overwhelming when we look at all these different elements and features and parts and things that we can start to pull in. And yes, there are wonderful design strategies embedded in in each and every one of those that are going to resonate with different groups more so than others. And so you kind of do, like we said, get to kind of pick and choose. But within that, I would say that at that individual level, like anytime that you enter a room, what happens if we allowed ourselves and our students to just kind of first pause, actually look at that space and go through the process of deciding what are their options and what are the available resources within that space, whether it be the seating, the building features, the unique characteristics, what the learning curriculum is that day. And then once they kind of take inventory of that, can we start to challenge them and ourselves to look at it and say, okay, what can I control? What can I do about that? We know that control of one's environment minimizes stress, it tunes you into your own body, it sets the stage for health. So can we, and we may not be able to control everything, but can we control the light, the air? Do we even know where the thermostat is at? Is the furniture arrangement fixed or flexible? Can we move within our spaces? What is the format and the goal of the learning objective? Like if we take the curriculum, can we be creative in how we start to make that a collaborative effort between our buildings and our teachers and our spaces and make it very easy to use in that way? And so then once we've kind of, first looked around, asked what we can do about it, like how do we empower people to be able to adjust and customize and make that work for their classrooms and for their schools. And just trying to, again, ensure a collaborative relationship between our buildings and us as we start to engage with them. So I would like to say, and then just from the perspective of, like we had talked about a little before, the process is really fun. And so I think don't be afraid of the process. Like we always say, like, okay, let's go through the discovery process. Let's figure out what we can create. Let's experience it. And then really the other one that should be here is let's adjust it, because I think letting go of that fear to try and figuring out like, where can we make the most strategic impacts? And let's start with those and then figure out like on a day-by-day basis, like where we take it from there. So like I said, I think that there are some wonderful overlaps between the wonderful school design and innovative concepts that we're seeing and the WELL Building Standard and how they have really embraced and incorporated a lot of those same concepts that are already having a lot of impact within our schools. And so I hope that this was helpful for all of you as far as having a little bit better understanding of the WELL Building Standard in general, and have enjoyed spending this virtual time with you. And hopefully we will be able to do this again sometime soon in person. So thank you so much for the time today.